الله بالخير. لعل القارة الآسيوية باتت اليوم محورا للمنافسة الصينية الأميركية، ومن دون شك فإن مجالها البحرية بات مركزا للنزاعات المباشرة أو بالوكالة. الخطر والتنمية والمشروعية في السياسة البحرية لشرق آسيا، أمن البحار من أمن الدولة، كتاب لكريستيان وورث يقارب بعمق قضايا الأمن البحري في شرق آسيا والتحديات الداهمة. كيف تنظر دول شرق آسيا إلى البحر كمصدر للفرص والمخاطر على حد سواء؟ الصين كقوة بحرية عليا في المنطقة، هل تحاصر أميركا خارج بحر الصين الجنوبي؟ هل تحاول الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية احتواء التمدد الصيني عبر تايوان؟ لماذا زار هنري كيسنجر بكين؟ هل بات التفاوض مع الصين حاجة ملحة لأميركا؟ لماذا يتعين على الصين وروسيا قيادة إصلاح الحكم العالمي؟ وما يعني ذلك؟ ما هي استراتيجية الصين في الجنوب العالمي؟ نرحب بكم ونرى ونسمع أكثر من ضيفنا من بكين شو تشيندو، الباحث السياسي في مركز الأبحاث الصيني بانغول في البعد الأقرب. هذه الميادين وأنا زينب صفار، خليكم ويانا. شو تشيندو, Chinese political analyst, TV host, writer and commentator, senior fellow at the Pangol Institution. Mr. Shu, salam and welcome to Al Mayadeen. This is the proximate aspect. I'm Zainab Al Safar, so good to have you.
Thank you for having me.
Always a pleasure. Well, the maritime sphere is the center stage on which both regionalism and power shift unfold. In fact, about 60% of the maritime trade by volume passes through Asia, and about 1/3 goes through the South China Sea. Current dynamics in the Indo-Pacific region have given rise to intense geopolitical competition. Why has the maritime sphere, and in particular in this region, become imbued with increasing levels of danger?
It's a good question. You know, if you look at Asia right now, probably two, I would say, hotspots. One is the South China Sea, the other being Taiwan. It all has something to do with the United States and China. So in nature, I would describe that as a relationship between China and the US. So it's really a consequence of the evolvement of China-US relationship from one of engagement to now a confrontational one. In which the U.S. has introduced the policies for, you can vividly describe them as trade war, tech war, or disinformation war, or narrative war against China.
Exactly.
So you have, increasingly more assertive, sometimes I would say aggressive behavior by the U.S. to navigate their aircraft carrier and war ships in South China Sea, and sending more weapons to Taiwan, measures like this to challenge the rise of China, or using their own words, to counterize the rise of China.
Right. According to our reference paper, Mr. Xu, danger, development and legitimacy in East Asia maritime politics, securing the seas, securing the state. Well, since World War II, unresolved delimitation of territorial sovereignty has been contributing to the maritime sphere becoming an arena for interstate rivalry and bickering. What makes the maritime territorial disputes heat up in your region, sir?
Good question. Frankly speaking, the disputes, mostly reported in the media is between China and other countries. But in reality, it's really between China and Vietnam, between Vietnam and Malaysia, for example, between Vietnam and the Philippines, or between the Philippines and other regional players. If you look at the Chinese position on the South China Sea, which includes the 9 dash lines, and compare that with that of Taiwan, you would see they are the same. The claims are identical. And of course, the US would like to present China's claim as being aggressive, as being from a powerful country, which does not follow the international rules. But if you find out it's the same claim as that in Taiwan, I think people would find a bit awkward, a bit, I would say, embarrassing. What happened? Because, for example, the 9 dash line...
To the extent of banning a movie, a Hollywood movie that displays this kind of line on a certain map.
That's true. If you look at the map, people would find the 9 dash line, previously known as 11 dash line. It was not drawn by the current Chinese government or the People's Republic of China. It was drawn in 1947, for example, 1948, the time a couple of years before the founding of the People's Republic of China. And then people would ask, which government, drew such dash lines? It was the Republic of China, which is now in Taiwan. And since 1949, there's before 1949, I would say, there is a civil war, 1945 to 1949, between KMT, which is now a party in Taiwan, and the communists now ruling China. So, the KMT was defeated and they escaped to Taiwan. And now, that's why we are having a Taiwan question. It's a legacy of the civil war between the two political forces. And then the dash line was drawn by KMT, the government which it ruled before 1949. They drew this dash line with the support of the United States. One thing I need to make it clear that is, at that time, before 1949, China and the US were allies. So the US basically, asked China to take care of the security of this region. And then they helped China draw the 9 or 11 dash line. Within the dash line, it's deep enough to have, sea battles. You can have submarines. Outside the battle line, 9 dash line.
The dash line or the U-shaped line.
Have the sea battles.
Yes.
So basically, the U.S. asked the Republic of China, or the then Chinese government, to take care of the security because we are allies. So this region, on behalf of the U.S., you take care of the security. After drawing the 9 dash line, the Chinese government at that time basically presented it to the UN and asked any responses from neighboring countries, including the Philippines, Malaysians, Vietnamese. But at that time, we know that the Philippines was only got independent like a couple of years, so there's not really official response. And the Malaysia, was still under the rule, I believe, of I would say under colonized.
Sure.
Vietnam was divided.
Right.
So there's not really any response to this 9 dash line.
In terms of security, Mr. Xu, might you tell us more how East Asian states perceive the sea as site of both threat and opportunity? What is the crucial role played by the sea in legitimizing the modern state and securing its future?
First of all, I want to respond basically to an earlier question. you mentioned about this important sea lands for businesses and trade, investment. For example, people would say, trillions of dollars worth of goods will be transferred through this land. And then, of course, if you take a closer look, most of the goods and services being transferred, being carried through these sea lanes, they are from China to Australia, from China to other ASEAN countries in this region, from China to Africa, China to, even India. So, China is the biggest beneficiary of security through these sea lanes. Mm-hmm. So there's a misperception somehow like China is destabilizing this sea lanes. Oh, the sea lanes are valuable. We have to secure it. Okay, who will secure the lands? Oh, the United States. No, this is the story from or narrative from Washington. Mm-hmm. The country which cares the most about the security of the South China Sea, I would say, is China. China, or at least China is one of the countries which cares very much about the security.
Yes, Mr. Xu, allow me here to ask you, you're talking about the U.S. and its perspective when it comes to China in this particular region and the South China Sea. A report published by the Wall Street Journal uncovers that Beijing is becoming the dominant force in the South China Sea, through which, as you said, trillions of dollars in trade passes each year. Is China's economic security closely tied to the South China Sea, and has Beijing boxed Washington out of the South China Sea, please?
This is the nature of the disputes between China and the United States. This is far beyond the South China Sea, unfortunately. When we talk about the South China Sea territorial disputes, for example, between neighboring countries, Vietnam, China, Malaysia, the Philippines, or Taiwan, it's really about, which islands, or islets. Mm-hmm. Sometimes it's claimed by both countries or more than, two countries. So that's the regional disputes. But then all they agree is let's sit down and talk through our differences. If we cannot solve our problem now, let's shelve it and focus on cooperation. That's basically the idea of regional countries. But then there's the involvement of the United States. The United States, first of all, is not a claimant to any territory here or sea waters in this region. The U.S. involvement is based on the idea of so-called freedom of navigation. So I can send my warplanes, my warships to navigate through these sea lanes. Mm-hmm. It's like a policeman. I'm here to make sure there is a security. Things like, the U.S. is not invited by any country.
What is Chinese strategy in this sense?
The Chinese strategy is let's focus on development. Let's focus on trade. For example, that's why there is a RCEP, a trade agreement, probably the largest one in the world, involving China, Japan, South Korea, and New Zealand, Australia, and the 10 ASEAN countries, and 16 countries. And, the regional, most important regional economic players. So that's in the benefits of every country to see peace and stability. Sure. Because you see barriers will be removed for trade and investment, for the freedom of the movement of people and goods. So everybody will benefit from such such a trade agreement. In that sense, that will secure the economic interests of every country.
Right, sure. The Taiwan question is a focal issue of China's core interest, the most consequential issue and the most pronounced risk in China-US relations, according, of course, to the Chinese Defense Ministry. Is the US trying to contain China through Taiwan? And despite rising tensions, is it possible to avoid war in the region? Have they not learned from the lessons from Ukraine yet?
That's a wonderful question. I think that everyone should pay attention to, if they can, to this question, because we are seeing the basically, you have to understand, what's going on in Ukraine, or what has led to the Ukraine crisis in the first place. I think most people outside of the Western camp would point to the NATO expansion, which threatens the national security of Russia. And then in return, Russia respond in a way that is what we are seeing now, in the violent way, to protect its national interests, its national security. And now the Taiwan question, as we said, is a leftover of the Chinese Civil War. On both sides, Taiwan and the mainland, we are the same people, brothers, sisters.
They were defending themselves, of course, Mr. Xu, the Russians, and of course the Chinese are going to respond in kind to such kind of provocations and attacks, right?
That's true. That's exactly the idea. For most of the Chinese people, I mean, because that's the core of the Chinese core interest. That's national sovereignty and the national territorial integrity.
True.
And China, if you look at history, it has always paid the highest attention to national unification. That's our idea. So the U.S. right now is doing, if you look at the official establishment of the foreign relationship between Beijing and Washington in 1979, for example, basically there are 3 communiques serving the foundation of this bilateral relationship. That is, and one of the focal, question is the Taiwan question. The U.S. promise is like, we follow the Taiwan one China policy using their own term. The Chinese term is like a one China principle.
Yes.
For any sense, the U.S. says,
Taiwan is a red line.
Yes, Taiwan is definitely a red line. And because for any Chinese government, Beijing government, there's no way for them to back down in terms of Taiwan.
Yes.
You have one way to look at Taiwan question, is really from this bilateral relationship, I would say big picture.
Right.
The U.S. idea is really to recent years since Donald Trump.
Yes.
We have seen the trade war, the tech war, technological war against China, and then you have this disinformation or narrative war, perception war against China, and the economic war.
Right.
And Taiwan is the next target. Is really using Taiwan or weaponizing Taiwan against China. If there is
but allow me, on the other hand, Mr. Xu, American policymakers still hope perhaps for bilateral cooperation on global issues such as climate change, biodiversity, and nuclear non-proliferation, etc. In recent months, Antony Blinken, Janet Yellen, and John Kerry have all marched to Beijing. China's response, of course, to these visits, according to observers, has been correct but not warm. However, its leadership rolled out the red carpet for former National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger. Why did Kissinger go to China? What for?
I think a lot of people have a similar question, why Kissinger was in Beijing, because given his age, I would say he's really working hard. Obviously, there's something deeply worries him, who is known for being a strategist, about global development. First of all, I would say, Kissinger is a U.S. citizen. He was in Beijing for the interests of the United States. Let's, do not make any mistake about his purpose. Of course, his purpose could be for the U.S. interests, but at the same time for peace and stability, because he understands the 2 great countries, China and the U.S., can't afford to have a war or a military conflict, because both countries will suffer greatly if there's a war between Beijing and Washington. Despite all the talk in Washington right now by the politicians that they need to be prepared to have a war with China, or they need to go to war with China sooner than later, because sooner would be better to serve the interest of the United States. And I think deep in their heart, they understand China is not, let's say, Afghanistan or Iraq, the U.S. can defeat like in a couple of weeks. China is a great power with 1.4 billion people. I would say, victory or defeat is uncertain for both countries. So at least even there's a victory, so-called victory, I would say that's a devastating victory, So there's no real victory if there's a war between the 2 countries. I think that's the understanding of Kissinger.
We all have to know that China has not been involved in any expensive wars or invaded any country for the last 70 years. True?
That is true. That is true. Basically, China has, the Chinese philosophy, let's say, philosophy of governance or philosophy of foreign affairs is, let's create a peaceful world or peaceful environment, at least a peaceful environment surrounding China, so we can focus on development.
Right. In talking about
That
governance,
is the idea.
True, very true.
Yes.
President Xi hosted recently the Speaker of the Russian Senate, Valentina Matvienko, in Beijing for 4 days, of course, where he said that China and Russia should lead global governance reform. Why and what does that mean, Xu?
If you look at the stakes in the IMF, International Monetary Fund, despite being the second largest economy in the world, China's stake is much smaller, much smaller, disproportionately smaller, and India too. So there are complaints. You say this is unfair in terms of providing the governance, in terms of governing the world. If you carry that by economic weight, so the influence of the developing countries, like the BRICS countries, should be much larger. But in the existing institutions, there's no way for them to speak out or no way to exercise that kind of influence. That's why we have this AIIB, Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, led by China, joined by India and dozens of countries. And also you have this new development bank, basically all BRICS bank, by Brazil, China, India.
Headed by Dilma
Rousseff.
True.
Yes. So that idea is really about to create more fairness, more equality between the Western world and the non-Western world. That's the idea of global governance reform.
Sure. Allow me to ask this. Since the war in Ukraine, there's a new divide. The Global South does not agree with the US and the NATO policy. The Global South wants a new world order based on multipolarity. What is China's strategy in the Global South?
There's no really clear strategy, but I would say China's idea largely is being increasingly clear. That is to side with the Global South. China is a developing country. If you check the statement from the Chinese officials or from Chinese government, the idea is like China will always stay with the Global South. Will always stay with the developing world. So that's why we are seeing, for example, the development initiative, global development initiative proposed in 2021 at the UN, basically to help achieve the SDG, the Sustainable Development Goals set by the United Nations. And then you have this security initiative, which stresses about inclusive security. That is, one country cannot say, I have this exclusive security, disregarding the security of other parties. That's a practice by Washington, frankly speaking. Washington always talks about, they are being threatened by, for example, another country, Iran or North Korea, or previously, Iraq, other much smaller countries. It makes people wonder why they are threatening the US. Usually, US is the biggest threat to many other countries.
Excellent. Xu Qindu, Senior Fellow at Bengal Institution. Thank you very much, sir, for this pithy talk. Always a pleasure to have you.
Thank you for having me.
Most welcome. إذن كما يقول الدبلوماسي السنغافوري السابق كيشور مهبوباني في كتابه القرن 21 الآسيوي، انتهى القرن الأميركي والقرن الآسيوي آت. إذا حاولت الولايات المتحدة احتواء الصين فبدلاً من عزلها للصين ستجد نفسها معزولة عن بقية العالم. ولعل المنافسة الرئيسية بين الولايات المتحدة والصين ستكون على المستوى الاقتصادي، لا في تعزيز وجودها العسكري في شرق آسيا، لأن التنافس لن يكون في البعد العسكري بل سيكون في البعد الاقتصادي. عندما اتخذت الولايات المتحدة قراراً بالانسحاب من الشراكة عبر المحيط الهادئ TPP في الوقت الذي انضمت فيه الصين إلى الشراكة الاقتصادية الإقليمية الشاملة، لم تفقه آنذاك أن اللعبة هي الاقتصاد والتجارة. من خلال عدم المشاركة في هذه الاتفاقيات التجارية عبر المحيط الهادئ، كانت الولايات المتحدة تمنح الصين في الواقع أفضلية في المنافسة الاقتصادية الرئيسية. اليوم المخاطر أعلى من أي وقت مضى، ولكن هل تفكر الإدارة الأمريكية في هذا الأمر عندما تشرع بخفة دعمها لمشاريع استفزازية وعدائية؟ وهل يدخل احتمال الفشل في وعيها؟ من كل الميادين، سلاما وتحية، في أمان الله.